July 2011. Everyone in Mexico was glued to their screens watching something truly horrifying. A video had surfaced showing two guys, Felix Gomez Garcia and his uncle Barnabas Gomez, being brutally cut apart with a chainsaw by cartel members. It was a chilling moment that really showed how extreme cartel violence can get. Here are some really gruesome methods they use to execute people. Number 7. The Stew. January 2009. Something big happened in a neighborhood in Tijuana called Baja Seasons. Santiago Mesa Lopez, who people called El Pozolero, which means the pozole maker, was caught by the Mexican army. This guy was infamous for a really dark reason. He had gotten rid of over 300 bodies by dissolving them in acid at his ranch in Ensenada. He had this terrifying method where he'd put victims in a huge pot filled with gasoline or acid, then light it up to burn everything to nothing. Lopez was born in a poor area of Sinaloa, Mexico, back in April 1964. His life took a dark turn after he moved to Tijuana in the 1990s. After a violent attack on his sister by a gang, he ended up joining the Tijuana cartel to get revenge. He quickly moved up in the ranks, and the cartel boss, Efrain Perez, gave him the grim job of getting rid of bodies. He would use a mix of acid and other harsh chemicals to melt the bodies in barrels, heating it until nothing but bits and pieces were left, which he then either threw away or burned even more. Even though he said he was forced into doing this horrible job by the Arañano Felix cartel in 1996, he kept at it for years until he was finally caught. First, they gave him a 10-year sentence in 2012, but people were so shocked and upset by what he did that the court decided to add another 30 years to his sentence in 2024. His story, known as El Guiso, or the Stew, is one of those chilling tales that stick with you because it shows how awful people can be. Number 6. Dismemberment. Marciano Chano Milan Vasquez, a notorious figure in the Los Zetas cartel, was arrested over a horrifying incident from 2013 involving the abduction of a former drug trafficking colleague. The chilling details came to light in a courtroom where the kidnapped man, once blindfolded and trembling with fear, shared his nightmarish experience. He described how he was taken to a secluded horror spot where Vasquez had held his family captive. When they finally took his blindfold off, he was faced with a horrifying sight. A couple and their daughter standing next to a burning barrel, absolute terror on their faces. In a shocking display of power and cruelty, Vasquez, surrounded by his cartel crew, forced the horrified parents to watch as he brutally chopped up their young daughter with an axe. This gruesome act is a signature method of the cartel. To make sure the victims fully experience their slow and painful end, they are sometimes injected with drugs like morphine or adrenaline. This keeps them painfully aware as they are slowly dismembered, with cartel members deliberately avoiding vital organs to prolong the suffering caused by blood loss and infection. This grim ritual also makes disposing of the body easier for them. Sometimes they even display the severed parts in public to warn anyone who might think of crossing them. One such horrific incident happened in October 2010 with Israel Rinson, a cartel member who had killed a fellow associate. Directed by El Chapo, Rinson was subjected to severe torture, extended by a doctor to delay his death. After enduring unbearable pain, Rinson was dismembered, and his remains were carelessly thrown away in Cancun. This brutal act highlights the ruthless methods and the total disregard for human life that these cartels have. Number 5. Tahua Cananzo. February 12, 2019. The trial of El Chapo opened everyone's eyes to some truly shocking stuff, revealing the brutal methods used by the Sinaloa cartel. One method that really stood out was a terrifying take on waterboarding they called Tahua Cananzo. This involves pouring water over a cloth placed over someone's face, simulating the feeling of drowning. It's an old torture method, but the cartel has given it a cruel twist. Originally used way back during times like the Spanish Inquisition and by the Khmer Rouge, waterboarding itself is pretty old, but the cartel has made it even more horrifying. They use carbonated water, sometimes mixed with chili pepper to make the pain even worse. The fizzy water and the spices increase the burning sensation and the panic, making the cloth stick to every part of the victim's face, making it feel even more like they're actually drowning. The cartel has refined this method to not only torture, but to really prolong the suffering, adding water bit by bit to stretch out the fear and delay the end. This method is not just about causing physical pain, it's about instilling deep psychological terror. By adding carbonated water and chili, the cartels have evolved this old technique into something even more sinister, showing how far they'll go in their cruel actions against others. Number 4. La Paleta. 1980s. Showing off wild exotic animals became a creepy way for the rich to show off their wealth. This trend started with guys like Pablo Escobar, who had a huge zoo right on his property to show how powerful he was. But in Mexico, things were even scarier because drug cartels didn't just use these fierce animals as a showpiece. They used them to kill people. Imagine being so scared, begging for your life before being eaten by hungry wild beasts. There was this guy named Heriberto Luzcano, known for being super brutal. He was born into a really poor family in Hidalgo, Mexico on Christmas in 1974. At 17, he joined the military, hoping to make something of himself by fighting guerrillas and drug rings. But in 1998, he left the army and got pulled into the dark world of cartels, working with some notorious cartel leaders and helped to start the feared Los Zetas gang. Luzcano, known as Z3 or Alaska in the crime world, and he was famous for not just being smart, but also for how cruelly he controlled and punished people. He would beat people with a wooden board and once tied a man to a tree, breaking his legs, and left him to die slowly. That's the level of his cruelty. At his range, he kept lions and tigers, and he'd use these hungry but strong animals to kill as a form of entertainment. He'd actually make a show of it, watching people get torn apart. Despite all his terror, Luzcano didn't die from his own animals, but was killed by the Mexican military in a shootout in 2012. His death ended a really dark chapter of cartel violence, a time marked by so much fear and bloodshed. Number 3. Flaying. 2018, in the hot town of La Union, Mexico, a really shocking video popped up online. It showed a father and his son, both tied up and gagged, going through a terrible time at the hands of a Mexican cartel. The video was brutal. The dad was hit over and over again with a big stick, and then, right in front of his son, they cut off his head with a dull knife. The video showed the son's horrible pain as he watched his dad die. His shock and deep sadness were heart-wrenching. It seemed like the dad knew what was coming, maybe because of all he'd been through before. After the dad was killed, the son was tortured even more horribly, getting stabbed multiple times. Though he kept passing out, he somehow survived this nightmare. This awful video really shows how far these cartels will go to keep control and scare their enemies. Like this one notorious event in 2010. Even the famous cartel boss El Chapo was said to have recorded himself doing something gruesome to a guy from a rival gang. They used a chainsaw to skin him, then stretched his skin over a ball to send a clear, scary message to another cartel. They left his body in a plastic container and scattered his parts around town. Cartel guys sometimes do this skinning thing to people they see as big threats, like members of other gangs or traitors. Doctors say dying this way is horrible, with shock, blood loss, or infection dragging out the pain for hours or even days. Number 2. Cannibalism. Every person who joins the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, also known as CJNG, has to go through something truly horrifying when they start. Their leader, Nemesio El Mencho Oseguera Cervantes, has introduced something really gruesome into their training: cannibalism. This cartel isn't just in Mexico. They're in at least 35 states and even Puerto Rico. They use this awful practice to toughen up new members, making them capable of handling any kind of brutality without flinching. The way they bring their new recruits in is just brutal. They actually make them eat parts of bodies, starting with small bits like fingers and toes, and it gets worse from there. If anyone shows like they're struggling, like if they gag, they are forced to eat their own vomit. It's a harsh way to push them to their limits. At night, they have to sleep next to dead bodies, which is supposed to make them completely numb to the horror of death. This whole process is twofold. It's meant to train them, sure, but it also messes with their heads, making them fiercely loyal to the cartel by stripping away their personal identity. Now, there's another cartel boss, Miguel Trevino Morales, also known as Z40 from the Zetas cartel, who took this to another level. He'd eat the hearts of his victims, thinking it made him invincible against his enemies and the law. It was also his way of scaring other gangs. Some people who used to work for him have said that he'd sometimes make his captives join in on these cannibalistic rituals, making the whole thing even more terrifying. These practices go beyond merely demonstrating violence. They're calculated moves in a psychological warfare, aiming to dominate and control in the scary world of drug cartels. Number 1. Hanging. 2016, outside Tijuana, really close to the U.S. border, there was a shocking scene. A body was hanging from a bridge. This was a grim sign of the extreme violence that's rampant in that area because of the drug trade. According to the San Diego Union Tribune, from January to October 2018, there were over 1,250 murders in Tijuana alone, all linked to drugs. The violence hit an all-time high in November 2021 in Zacatecas, where the police found 9 bodies hanging from a bridge. This wasn't just a random act of violence. It was a clear and horrifying message from one cartel to another, kind of repeating a past horror where 14 guys connected to the Los Zetos cartel were brutally killed in Nuevo Laredo. Those bodies were left hanging from early morning until mid-morning, on display for nearly 4 hours before the cops stepped in. This way of showing power through public execution surpasses modern horror. It's like something out of the Dark Ages or something the Taliban would do. For these cartels, putting up such displays is a strategic move to show dominance and spread fear. The more bodies they hang up, the stronger their message. These are usually people from rival groups who were caught in gunfights, or those unlucky enough to be kidnapped by the cartel.